Before we get into the theory, here's what this episode may actually be setting up. While many fans are focused on the emotional distance growing between Becca and Agnes, the bigger story might be hiding in plain sight. Becca suddenly seems different. For the first time in a long while, she doesn't look trapped or hopeless. And strangely enough, that change seems connected to Garth. But is Becca really going to marry him? Or is the show quietly building towards something much bigger involving Mayday, Agnes, and a truth that could completely destroy everything Becca believes about her own family? Let's break it all down. There is one question the Testament seems to be pushing viewers toward right now, and it's surprisingly simple. Will Becca actually marry Garth? After this episode, the answer feels much closer to yes than many fans probably expected. And honestly, if you really look at Becca's situation, her choice suddenly starts making a lot more sense. Because this is not a story about romance, it is a story about survival. That distinction matters. When fans discuss relationships in shows like The Testaments, it is easy to fall into the trap of asking who characters love or who they belong with emotionally. But Gilead destroys normal relationship logic. Love barely matters here. Safety matters. Stability matters. Survival matters most. And Becca understands that better than almost anyone. This episode quietly shows us something important about her mindset. She is exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. She understands exactly what happens to girls who make the wrong choices in Gilead. She knows what happens when women lose protection, lose status, or step outside the narrow path they are expected to follow. The colonies are always hanging over these characters like a nightmare waiting to happen. That fear changes people. Suddenly, marriage stops being about affection and starts becoming about protection. And when Becca looks at Garth, she may not be seeing the love of her life, but she probably sees something equally valuable in Gilead: safety. Let's be honest here. Compared to the alternatives, Garth looks like the best option Becca could realistically hope for, especially after what happened with that older commander. The show very intentionally made viewers uncomfortable around him. Everything about that situation felt predatory. Trying to get Becca drunk was not just creepy, it symbolized the kind of future many women in Gilead are forced into. A future where power imbalances are disguised as marriage, and fear becomes part of everyday life. That man represented danger. Garth represents something completely different, at least from what the show has shown us so far. Garth appears calmer, more respectful, and less controlling than the kinds of men Gilead usually rewards. Is he perfect? No. We still don't know everything about him. But compared to Becca's other options, he feels safer. And that difference is huge, because for the first time in what feels like forever, Becca doesn't look completely miserable. That small detail might actually be one of the biggest clues in the entire episode. Think about it. For most of the story, Becca has carried this quiet sadness around her. Even when she smiled, there was always something heavy underneath. She often felt emotionally trapped, conflicted, or disconnected from the life Gilead expected her to accept. But suddenly, something has shifted. Not dramatically, not in some huge, obvious way, but enough to notice. And shows like The Testaments rarely make emotional changes accidental. When writers subtly change a character's emotional state, they usually want the audience paying attention. So the question becomes, why does Becca suddenly seem lighter? One explanation is heartbreaking but realistic. Maybe she has simply accepted her reality. Not because she agrees with it, not because she wants it, but because she understands resistance without a plan can get you destroyed. And honestly, that feels very human. Sometimes survival means making impossible choices. Sometimes survival means choosing the least terrible option. And right now, Garth may simply be Becca's least terrible option. But here's where things get interesting, because I don't think Becca is choosing romance. I think she's choosing peace. Or at least the closest version of peace that exists in Gilead. She probably knows she may never truly love Garth romantically. The emotional connection doesn't seem to be built on passion, but friendship, respect, emotional safety. That feels possible. And weirdly enough, in a world as brutal as Gilead, that may be enough to build a life on. But there's another reason why this possible marriage feels so important, and it has everything to do with something Becca doesn't know yet: Garth's connection to Mayday. The audience currently has an advantage Becca doesn't have. Right now, Becca likely sees Garth as a practical decision, a respectful man who offers her protection and stability. But what happens when she eventually discovers he's secretly resisting Gilead? Because if that reveal happens, everything changes. Suddenly, this marriage is no longer just survival. It becomes dangerous, political, potentially revolutionary. And honestly, that possibility makes Becca marrying Garth feel even more likely. Why? Because it gives the writer somewhere interesting to take her story. Right now, Becca feels emotionally stuck between fear, loyalty, and uncertainty. But if Garth slowly exposes her to the truth about Gilead, or even introduces her to resistance through Mayday, it could completely reshape who she becomes. Especially if another painful truth finally comes to light: her father. This might actually be the darkest possibility hanging over Becca's story. Book readers already know there are disturbing implications surrounding her father, Dr. Grove. Naturally, many fans expected the adaptation to follow a similar path, but so far, the show seems to be handling things more carefully. And honestly, there are clues pointing in different directions. Because if Becca already knew what her father had done to Agnes and others, you'd probably expect signs: distance, fear, emotional discomfort, moments where she avoids him. But instead, the show has given us scenes that almost suggest the opposite. Think back to episode 4. When Agnes chipped her tooth, Becca comforted her by reassuring her that her father could help fix it. That scene suddenly feels much more important now, because at least based on what we've seen, Becca appears to trust him. And if she truly has no idea what he's done, the eventual truth could absolutely devastate her. Imagine learning that the father you trusted, the person meant to protect people, was secretly harming those closest to you. That kind of betrayal changes everything, and it could completely explain why Becca eventually turns against Gilead. Because systems like Gilead survive through silence. They survive because powerful men are protected, because victims stay afraid, because people look away. If Becca realizes her own father represents everything broken inside the system, it could become the exact moment her loyalty finally shatters. And suddenly, Garth's secret Mayday connection becomes even more meaningful, because instead of simply being a husband, he may become the person who helps Becca see reality clearly. Not through romance, but through truth. Now, of course, there is another possibility here. What if Becca never marries Garth at all? It's worth considering. Maybe something happens before the wedding. Maybe Agnes becomes emotionally important enough again to change Becca's path. Maybe Becca learns the truth about Garth too early and panics. Or maybe her father's secrets explode everything before marriage can even happen. Those possibilities absolutely exist, but if we're looking at where the show seems to be heading right now, marriage still feels like the strongest outcome, mostly because it solves multiple story problems at once. It protects Becca from worse options. It puts her closer to Mayday. It creates emotional tension involving Agnes, and it gives the writers room to explore sacrifice, loyalty, and rebellion in a much deeper way. Because let's talk about Agnes for a second. Even though Becca and Agnes feel emotionally distant right now, I genuinely don't think the show is done with them. In fact, I think this separation is temporary. Painful, yes, but temporary. Their relationship still feels unresolved in a way that screams unfinished story. Whether viewers interpret their connection romantically or emotionally, one thing feels obvious. These two people matter deeply to each other. You can feel it in the sadness, the awkwardness, the distance that somehow still feels emotionally close. Writers don't usually create that kind of emotional tension for no reason. And this is where things could get incredibly complicated. Because what if Becca marries Garth, but the marriage eventually becomes something different from what Gilead intended? What if it becomes an arrangement? Think about it. Garth respects Becca. Becca trusts Garth. And if Garth truly values freedom more than power, he may quietly offer Becca something almost impossible to find in Gilead: agency. A choice, protection without ownership. That would completely change the emotional dynamic, especially if Agnes eventually re-enters Becca's emotional life in a major way. Could Becca eventually make a massive sacrifice for Agnes? Could Garth knowingly help protect them both? Could this strange marriage actually become the thing that helps all of them survive? The show may be quietly planting those seeds already. And if that is where this story is heading, then Becca's engagement suddenly becomes much bigger than a wedding storyline. It becomes the beginning of her transformation. Because maybe Becca is not surrendering. Maybe she's adapting. Maybe she's surviving long enough to become someone stronger later. And honestly, that feels very true to how the Testaments tell stories. The loudest rebels are rarely the only important ones. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the quiet ones, the people who seem to accept the system until one day they stop. And Becca feels exactly like that kind of character. So, will Becca marry Garth? Right now, I think there is a very strong chance she will. But I also think the show may be tricking us into seeing this as the ending of Becca's story. Because if anything, this marriage could end up being the moment her real story finally begins.